Tom, 50 years ago, maybe hard to believe, but that's when Martin Luther King was killed. It was in April 1968, if I'm not mistaken. So here we are 50 years later, and on Martin Luther King Day this year, I just thought, this would be a good opportunity to sit down and have you reflect on what Martin Luther King was at the time of his murder or assassination, and then we're going to move ahead to today, where what would he be like today? But you being a history teacher and certainly knowledgeable about what he was involved in, the civil rights and everything else, just what made him the man that a lot of people why did people just turn to him as kind of like their leader in the civil rights movement? We know there's a lot of hatred out there on all sides as well, but what made him the leader that he became, you think? What do you think?
Good question. He was very articulate and congenial and courageous. He wouldn't use violence when violence was used against him. And he showed the people who did use violence were extremists and very nasty. The FBI went after him too, politics, J. Edgar Hoover, even Attorney General Kennedy. They had some bad stuff on him, and they caused him trouble, and he had some personal issues. So I don't know if that would get far. His congeniality and brilliance might offend some extremists in the Antifa group who rationalized violence. He never did, and he was civil and congenial even when he was imprisoned. And so his traits and his eloquence and his lack of hypocrisy drew people to the cause. They had to believe him, and what he was dealing with they saw on television, and I think he would be instrumentally successful today, in fact very needed today, with the partisan animosities that are part of the political and social scene.
Well, for those who don't know a whole lot about him, one of his most memorable moments, certainly that "I Have a Dream" speech, which I'm sure we're going to be hearing this weekend, and it's always brought out by the media during observance of Martin Luther King Day and other times as well. And you think of all how many tens of thousands of people were there when he gave that speech. And then it really, he just stayed in and out of the news. I remember as a kid seeing he'd be in the news for walking in front of a protest, or they weren't here or weren't there. But as you said, he was never involved in any violence.
No, he was opposed to violence. Any group that would rationalize violence, that would disappoint some groups today. And he suffered violence, and he was in great danger for doing what he did. But I think that's what won people over. And we need him today in that philosophy, because the partisanship is so vicious on the political scene and in political groups. I think his influence could ameliorate that if he were still alive today with his philosophies and personality.
Mm-hmm. All right, if he were alive today, he'd be, I think, 80, 88, 89, or 90 years old. But what if he was at the age when he died, when he was killed? He was 39 years old. So let's go forward 50 years. He's with us now, 39 years old, with the environment we have today, with 24/7 media, the internet, and everything else. Do you think he'd still be the same guy?
Oh, I think so, because he wasn't a hypocrite. He lived and believed what he said, but his family has Republican strains, and I don't know if he was a Republican or not. That might draw the ire of some partisan groups. But he stands alone in his gifts, and again, I think they're needed today. And if he were here, he would apply them positively.
Do you think he'd be? I don't know if satisfied is the word, or satisfied would be the word, but that he would feel good about the progress that's been made in civil rights since his...
He wouldn't like identity politics. He gave speeches against it. Don't divide us into groups of ethnicity and race. We are all one, and we work together. That would go against the grain today with some groups.
So that would be like groups like Black Lives Matter? How would he feel about that group?
He'd be greatly opposed to it.
Mm-hmm.
The violence that they have either used or advocated or generated.
Now, he wasn't a politician, seen more as a civil rights leader. Do you think he would have got into politics? He was certainly a young man.
Well,
Could you see him as a senator or congressman, maybe running for the White House?
There are those people who are separation church and state advocates. They wouldn't like a clergyman running. But I think he had gifts that would have made him very successful there too.
Now there was a controversy over the naming of Martin Luther King Day. I think it went through Congress, went through a number of, I think some states that debated it. President Reagan, if I'm not mistaken, when it came to him, when they're trying to get him to sign the bill, said, "I'm nothing against Dr. King, but it's just another day for government to have a day off." And he thought it'd be, we're wasting time and money here, but wasn't it President Bush one that eventually did sign that bill, right?
And he did, and it was good. But Martin Luther King, in his cross-cultural outreach to solve problems, did have associations with communist leaders, and in those days, anti-communism was strong and necessary in the Cold War, and that caused some people to not want to honor him. Other people didn't want to honor him because of the racial thing, racism. Others because of philosophy. But I think he would overcome all that, and did.
According to my notes, it was Martin Luther King Day was formally adopted in 1986. And I know locally we went through some contentious times with the Rochester School Board. There were groups trying to get them to declare a day, and if they had a day, to give the kids a day off. State and local governments kind of haggled over it. And it was a lot of the same reason I think that a lot of the public felt that government already has a lot of days off. But you had other people saying, well, let's honor Dr. Martin Luther King with a day in his honor. We have President's Days, we have this, we have that, and eventually it was. And again, locally, it was neat to see that instead of we hear criticism sometimes from people on Memorial Day and Veterans Day. People get a day off, but they don't even know why. It's just becoming a holiday.
It did, but in the dogs and the police using dogs against demonstrators and rioters down south. That looked so bad for the police and that kind of violence that they ostensibly used. But a black historian has looked into that, and he has interviewed the wives and widows of some of the police officers involved, where the pictures were taken where the dogs were snarling and police with those dogs. And there were cases where, in fact, those Southern cops were trying to keep the dogs back from hurting blacks. And the picture was just the opposite. They were pulling the dogs back so they wouldn't harm the blacks that were demonstrating. Lots of sides to all of these things, and lots of emotion. And that's why I think it's good that your excellent questions make us analyze it.
Well, locally, I know for a number of years, they've held the annual Martin Luther King breakfast. A lot of the local politicians and community leaders go to that. There's usually a parade, depending on the weather. I think one year they had to postpone it because it was so dark and cold. It seems like every year we get to this holiday, and the weather does take a turn for the worse. So, and again, this year it looks like it will be cold. But just to summarize here, Tom, you think this was a really good thing to do for the country? And
oh, yes. I think it got us on the track of functional and pragmatic and mutually understood race issues and race relations and attempts to understand and resolve these things.
Okay, again, Martin Luther King died in 1968, assassinated, and it took a number of years, but now being remembered on Martin Luther King Day, and that will happen again this year as well. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.